The shawl was gone. Caroline Whitfield stood at the hitching post outside the general store in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, and stared at the bare, sun-bleached wood where she had draped her cream-colored wool shawl not 20 minutes ago. Her fingers reached out and touched the post as though her hands might find what her eyes could not, as though by sheer desperate want she could conjure the thing back into existence. The afternoon wind cut down the main street and raised the dust in little spiraling columns, and she felt the chill of it against her bare arms and knew, with the sick certainty of a woman who had already lost too much, that the shawl was not coming back on its own. She turned. She looked up and down the street. A pair of cowboys leaned against the saloon wall, too far gone in whiskey to be of use. Old Mrs. Tanner swept her boardwalk with the slow, indifferent rhythm of someone who had seen everything and cared about none of it. A dog slept in the shadow of the water trough. And then a small voice, clear as a bell and twice as surprising, came from directly behind her. "My papa brought it inside, ma'am," Caroline spun. Standing at the edge of the general store's front step was a girl of perhaps 8 years old, with dark braided hair and the most serious brown eyes Caroline had ever seen on a child. She was wearing a calico dress the color of sage, and she held her small hands folded in front of her as though she was delivering a telegram of great importance. "I beg your pardon," Caroline said. "Your shawl. You left it on the post and went inside the store." The wind came and blew it off, and it landed in the mud right there. The girl pointed at a patch of dark earth near the base of the post. "Papa saw it, and he brought it inside so it would not get ruined. He is inside. His name is Walter Merritt, and he will give it back. He is very trustworthy." She added this last with the gravity of someone who had never had reason to say anything less than the truth. Caroline stared at her for a moment. A betrayal of composure threatened to surface on her face, some flicker of amusement and surprise and something she could not yet name, before she pressed her lips together and nodded with great dignity. "Thank you," she said. "What is your name?" "Eliza Merritt," the girl said. "I am 8. Papa says I tell people that without them asking, but I think it is important information." This time Caroline could not stop the smile. She stepped up onto the boardwalk and pushed open the door of the general store. She did not know, standing in that doorway with the afternoon light behind her, that she was walking into the beginning of everything. She had arrived in Redemption Creek 7 weeks earlier, on the 3rd of March, 1882, on the southbound stage from Abilene. She had brought with her one trunk, one carpetbag, a tin box of books she could not bear to leave behind, and a grief so fresh it still felt like an open wound. Her husband, Thomas Whitfield, had died of a fever the previous October in Kansas City. He had been 31 years old and entirely unprepared to die, and Caroline at 27 had been equally unprepared to be left behind. There had been debts she had not known about. There had been a landlord with no patience. There had been a sister in Redemption Creek, a leaner, who had written to say she had a spare room and a strong opinion that Caroline needed a fresh start. Alina had been right about the room. The fresh start remained to be seen. Redemption Creek was not a romantic place. It was a town that had grown up around a creek and a cattle trail, built of practical wood and practical ambition, full of people who had come west for the same complicated mixture of hope and desperation that drove most westward migration. There was a general store run by a man named Calhoun, a blacksmith, a church with a listing steeple, a schoolhouse, a saloon that was 3 times busier than the church, a doctor who was also the dentist, and a sheriff named Briggs who had one good eye and the reputation of a fair man. It was the schoolhouse that had brought Caroline a reason to stay beyond her sister's hospitality. The previous schoolteacher, a young man from Ohio, had departed the previous January after a disagreement with the school board that everyone described differently depending on who you asked. The position had been vacant for 6 weeks. Alina had pushed Caroline toward the school board meeting with both hands and a great deal of encouragement, and the board, desperate and somewhat impressed by Caroline's qualifications, had hired her on the spot. And so Caroline Whitfield had become the schoolteacher of Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, and had begun the slow, practical business of rebuilding a life. She had not expected to feel anything for anyone for a very long time. She had not been looking for anything beyond the routine comfort of useful work and the strange, bittersweet peace of the Texas plains. She had not expected Walter Merritt. The inside of the general store smelled of tobacco and leather and the sharp sweetness of dried apple. Calhoun's shelves were stacked with the reliable inventory of a frontier establishment: bolts of fabric, canned goods, ammunition, rope, seed, axle grease, and the small luxuries that the women of the town requested with studied casualness: a bar of decent soap, a packet of tea, a paper of sewing needles. There were 2 men at the counter when Caroline entered. One was old Calhoun himself, gray-bearded and cheerful. The other was a man who stood with his back to the door, one elbow on the counter, talking to Calhoun with an ease that suggested they had been friends for a long time. He was tall and broad across the shoulders, wearing a dark coat worn soft at the elbows, and he had the kind of stillness about him that is not stillness at all, the controlled quiet of a man who has learned when to be still and when to move. Over his arm, folded with careful attention, was a cream-colored wool shawl. Calhoun looked up. "Miss Whitfield, afternoon." The tall man turned. He had a strong, angular face with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something that did not give easily. His eyes were dark gray, the color of the sky before rain, and they settled on her with an attention that was direct without being rude. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with sun-darkened skin and the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that come from years of squinting into a western horizon. There was a quality to his expression that she could not immediately name, some combination of steadiness and a quietly guarded kind of sadness that she recognized, because she had seen it in her own mirror. "You must be the shawl's owner," he said. His voice was low and even, a voice accustomed to being heard without raising itself. "And you must be Walter Merritt," she said. "Your daughter described you as very trustworthy." Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "She tells people that," he said. "I have not been able to decide whether to be grateful or alarmed." He held out the shawl. She stepped forward and took it, and for one brief moment the fabric passed between their hands and their fingers did not touch, but were close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him. "Thank you," she said. "I should not have left it outside. I did not think the wind would come up so quickly." "It does that here," he said. "Without warning. Everything in this country changes without warning." He said it simply as a statement of fact, but there was something underneath it that she caught and filed away, because it sounded like a man who had learned that lesson somewhere painful. "I am Caroline Whitfield," she said. "I am the new schoolteacher." "I know who you are," he said. "My daughter has spoken of nothing else since she heard the school was opening again. She has been home tutored this past year. I am afraid her standards are unreasonably high." Caroline looked at him steadily. "I shall endeavor to meet them." He nodded, and that was all. He turned back to Calhoun, and Caroline wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, and she went back out into the afternoon sunshine, and she told herself firmly that the dark gray color of a man's eyes was absolutely no reason to feel warm. Eliza Merritt appeared at the schoolhouse on the first Monday of April at precisely 8 in the morning, which was 20 minutes before any other student arrived. She had her hair in 2 braids, a slate and chalk in a cloth bag, and an expression of magnificent seriousness. She chose the second desk from the front, arranged her supplies with the precision of someone much older, folded her hands, and waited. Caroline, who had been writing the day's lesson on the blackboard, turned and found her there and felt a rush of the most uncomplicated affection she had experienced in months. "Good morning, Eliza." "Good morning, Miss Whitfield. I have read all the primers that were left in the schoolhouse. I thought you should know so you can adjust your instruction accordingly." Caroline pressed her lips together to maintain the appropriate teacherly gravity. "I appreciate the information. We will assess where everyone is beginning today." "I am ahead," Eliza said. not with arrogance but with the simple, factual certainty of a child who has always been surrounded by adults. "I have no doubt," Caroline said. The other children arrived in clusters, loud and uncertain, the way children are on the first day of a new teacher. There were 14 students in total, ranging from 6 to 14 years of age. Caroline had taught school in Kansas City before her marriage, and she felt the familiar rightness of it settle over her as she faced the room, the chalk in her hand, the morning light coming through the east windows, the expectant and suspicious and openly bored faces of 14 children who were all waiting to decide whether she was worth their attention. She taught them that first day with everything she had. She was funny when it served her and serious when it mattered. She found the shy ones and drew them out gently. She found the wild ones and challenged them toward something. She gave Eliza Merritt material 3 grades ahead of the rest of the class and watched the girl's serious face light up in a way that was not at all like her father's guarded, restrained expression, but was in fact exactly like it in structure. The same fundamental architecture of a person who does not give their delight away cheaply. Walter Merritt came to collect Eliza at 4 o'clock, and he tied his horse at the hitching post, and he stood in the schoolhouse doorway while Eliza gathered her things. "How was she?" he asked Caroline. "Exceptional," Caroline said honestly. "She is genuinely gifted, Mr. Merritt. I would like to loan her some additional reading materials if you have no objection." He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes. "She would love that," he said. "She has read everything on the ranch twice over." "The ranch," Caroline said. "I run cattle 3 miles east, the Merritt place." He paused. "It is not much to look at yet, but it is solid. The land is good." There was a defensiveness in the last 2 sentences that was so faint as to be almost invisible, the kind a man uses when he is accustomed to being judged and has grown very tired of it. "I am sure it is," Caroline said simply. She handed Eliza a copy of a geography reader and watched the girl hug it as though it was a personal gift from God. "Thank you, Miss Whitfield," Eliza said. "Thank you, Eliza," Caroline said. "You made today easier than it might have been." Eliza looked pleased and grave in equal measure and walked out to where her father held his horse. Caroline stood in the doorway and watched them ride away together, the big man and the small girl, and she felt the ache of something that was not quite loneliness and not quite longing, and sat somewhere uncomfortable between the two. She went back inside and cleaned the blackboard and did not think about the color of his eyes. She did not think about it for 3 whole days, which she considered a reasonable personal achievement. The next time she saw Walter Merritt was at the church social on the 2nd Sunday of April. These socials were the central social event of Redemption Creek's calendar, held after the Sunday service in the open yard behind the church, where the women brought food, and the men pretended they had come for the conversation rather than the food, and the children ran wild between the legs of the adults while everyone pretended not to notice. Eleanor had insisted Caroline come, partly from genuine sociability, and partly because Eleanor, who was married to a sensible man named Frank Dodd and had 2 children of her own, was conducting an ongoing campaign to ensure Caroline did not retreat entirely into her grief and her lesson plans. Caroline wore her best dress, a deep blue cotton with white collar and cuffs, and the cream-colored shawl, because the April mornings still had a bite to them in Texas. She helped carry the dishes Eleanor had prepared and spent the first part of the social being introduced to approximately every person in Redemption Creek by Eleanor, who made the introductions with the brisk efficiency of a woman with a purpose. Walter Merritt was standing near the far edge of the gathering, talking to another rancher, when Caroline arrived. She noticed him before she acknowledged noticing him, which she also considered a reasonable personal achievement. He wore a clean shirt and his good coat, and Eliza stood beside him in a white dress with a blue ribbon, and he had his hand resting on his daughter's shoulder in the unconscious, automatic way of a man who is always aware of where his child is. Eliza spotted Caroline first. She excused herself from her father's side with a solemnity that was almost courtly and crossed the yard to where Caroline stood. "Good morning, Miss Whitfield. You look very nice." "Good morning, Eliza. So do you." "Blue is your color." Eliza considered this. "Papa chose the ribbon. He has opinions about colors." This was such a specific and unexpected piece of information that Caroline looked across the yard at Walter Merritt involuntarily. He had turned from his conversation and was watching Eliza with the tolerant and slightly alarmed expression of a parent who knows his child is saying something she should not be saying but cannot yet tell what it is. "Does he?" Caroline said. "He says warm colors look better on most people than cold ones," Eliza said. "But he says your shawl is the right color for you because it is the color of something that has been kept safe indoors." Eliza paused. "He said that when I told him I saw you wearing it again. I do not entirely understand what he meant." Caroline felt something move in her chest. She kept her expression entirely calm. "Perhaps he simply meant it is a practical color," she said. "Perhaps," Eliza agreed, clearly unconvinced. Walter approached. He touched the brim of his hat to Caroline. "Miss Whitfield, I hope Eliza was not imparting information people did not ask for." "She was providing context," Caroline said pleasantly. "I find it useful." He made the almost smile again. "I had better take her to speak to the Briggs children before she provides any further context," he said. He guided Eliza away, and Caroline turned back to Alina, who was watching with a gleam in her eye that Caroline recognized and immediately wished to discourage. "He is a widower," Alina said, with the directness of someone who has decided the subject is open. "Alina," Caroline said, "his wife died 3 years ago, fever, same as Thomas." Alina's voice gentled at Thomas's name. "He has run that ranch alone with Eliza for 3 years. He does not come to socials often. He came today." "He brought his daughter," Caroline said. "Yes," Alina said. "He did," and her tone suggested she found this significant for reasons she was kind enough not to elaborate. In the weeks that followed, Caroline and Walter Merritt moved around each other in the careful, orbiting way of two people who are aware of each other without either of them saying so. He came to collect Eliza every afternoon, and sometimes he came early and stood in the schoolhouse doorway, and they talked, not about anything consequential, about the weather and the cattle and the books Caroline had recommended to Eliza, and the books he himself had read, which turned out to be a considerable number. She learned in these conversations that he had come to Texas from Virginia 10 years earlier, young and restless, and carrying what he described, briefly and without elaboration, as a need to be somewhere that did not already know his history. She understood this. She did not ask for elaboration, because she recognized the privacy of a past that has its own weight. She learned that he had married his wife, whose name was Clara, in 1876, and that Eliza had been born in 1874 before the marriage, a fact he stated so plainly and without apology that she understood it, had been the source of judgment that he had long ago decided to stop caring about. She learned that he had built the ranch himself with 2 hired hands, and that he was prouder of the water system he had devised for the stock than of almost anything else he had accomplished, and that this pride was the kind a man feels for a problem he solved with his own mind rather than money. She learned that he read history and that he distrusted newspaper editorializing, and that he had a particular and passionate hatred for cruelty in any form, which she found consistent with everything else she observed about him. She was falling. She could feel the physics of it even as she insisted to herself that she was not. She was a practical woman, and she had a practical knowledge of her own heart, and her heart was doing something that was decidedly impractical. The crisis came, as crises do in small towns, from an unexpected direction. His name was Gerald Beaumont, and he arrived in Redemption Creek at the end of April with money and a story about establishing a cattle operation north of town. He was 40 years old and handsome in the hard, deliberate way of a man who knows his looks and uses them, with a dark mustache and clothes that were too expensive for a man supposedly just establishing himself. He took an interest in Caroline within his first week in town. He was charming and he was attentive, and he had clearly identified the schoolteacher as someone worth cultivating. And Caroline, who had grown up with a mother who described men like this precisely, was not fooled for a moment. But she was polite. She was always polite. Beaumont asked Aline's husband Frank about her, which Frank mentioned to Aline, which Aline mentioned to Caroline with a significant look, and a warning about the dark past that seemed to follow men who arrived in western towns with large amounts of money and vague stories. The warning turned out to be more prophetic than Aline had intended. On the last Friday of April, Caroline was walking home from the school, alone in the late afternoon, when Beaumont came alongside her on his horse and dismounted to walk with her, which she had not invited. "Miss Whitfield," he said with the smooth confidence of a man who has never been told no in a way that stuck, "I was hoping I might speak with you." "Good afternoon, Mr. Beaumont," she said, and kept walking. "I understand you are the schoolteacher." "I am. And a widow." She stopped. She turned and looked at him with the full, direct gaze she reserved for students who had decided to test her. "I am," she said. That is not, however, an invitation to any particular kind of conversation. He raised his hands in a gesture of expansive harmlessness. "I mean no offense. I am simply a man who appreciates direct conversation. I admire you, Miss Whitfield. I would like the opportunity to court you properly." "I appreciate the directness," she said, "and I decline." He looked at her steadily for a moment, and something flickered in his eyes that was not offense, but rather the quick recalculation of a man who is not accustomed to closed doors. "You are certain," he said. "Entirely," she said. He nodded pleasantly, remounted, and rode away. She walked home and told herself the conversation was finished, because she was an optimist about human nature in the matters where she had not yet been proved wrong. She was wrong about this one. Beaumont came into the schoolhouse the following week on a Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to ask Caroline about the town's winter calendar for a stock drive he was planning. She was alone, the students having left at 4, and she was cleaning the blackboard, and when she turned and found him in the doorway she felt the first genuine unease. She kept it out of her voice. "Mr. Beaumont," she said, "can I help you?" "I thought we might revisit our conversation," he said, stepping inside. "There is nothing to revisit," she said. She set the eraser down and picked up the chalk and turned back to the board as though she had lesson planning to do, which was a deliberate signal that his presence had not altered her sense of her own space. "You are a woman alone in a new town," he said. "I am a man with considerable resources. This seems like a natural partnership." "Partnerships," she said, still writing on the board, "are formed between equals who want the same things." "That description does not apply here." He came 3 steps further into the room. She heard it and turned. "I am not a man who gives up easily," he said, and his tone had shifted just slightly from charm to something with more weight behind it. The door of the schoolhouse opened. Walter Merritt stood in it. He took in the scene in the particular rapid, quiet way of a man trained by years of reading country and weather and the intentions of animals and people. He looked at Caroline's face. He looked at Beaumont's position in the room. He looked at the distance between them. He made his assessment in approximately 1 second. "Eliza forgot her geography reader," he said, entirely calmly to Caroline. He came into the room and picked up the book that was, in fact, sitting on the front desk where Eliza had left it. He was not a small man. Standing in the room, he occupied a meaningful amount of it without appearing to try. He turned and looked at Beaumont with the level, measuring gray gaze that Caroline had seen, until now, only in its gentler applications. "Beaumont," he said. "Merritt," Beaumont said, and whatever had been building in his posture shifted sideways, adjusted, retreated. The 2 men knew each other, or knew of each other, and whatever Walter had communicated with 2 syllables, and a pair of dark gray eyes was sufficient. Beaumont looked at Caroline. He smiled with only the surface of his face. "Good evening, Miss Whitfield." He left. The room was quiet for a moment. "He was not here about a book," Caroline said. "No," Walter agreed. She looked at him. He was looking at the door. His jaw was set in the way she had come to recognize as the physical expression of something he was choosing not to say aloud. "Thank you," she said. "You were managing fine," he said. "I was," she agreed. "But it was better with you here." He turned from the door and looked at her, and something in his expression changed in a way that was not small or subtle, something that moved and settled into a new configuration the way landscape does after rain, the same elements, but different light, different weight. He nodded. He picked up the geography reader. He said good night. He walked out. Caroline stood in the empty schoolhouse for a long moment with the chalk still in her hand and her heart doing something completely unreasonable. She put the chalk down. She went home. She told Elinor nothing because Elinor's gleam was already intolerable on the existing evidence. Beaumont did not come back to the schoolhouse. But he did not leave Redemption Creek. He had established himself with enough visible legitimacy that Sheriff Briggs had no cause to move against him, and he continued to appear at the edges of Caroline's days with a persistence she found increasingly irritating. What she did not know, and what emerged slowly through the gossip networks of Redemption Creek, was that Beaumont had a connection to Walter Merritt's land that predated his arrival in town. She learned it from Eliza, who was, as established, a reliable source of information she had gathered by the simple method of listening carefully to adult conversations, while adults assumed she was otherwise occupied. On a Thursday afternoon in the middle of May, Eliza was the last student in the schoolhouse, waiting for her father who was delayed at the feed store. She was reading in the afternoon light and Caroline was grading slates, and Eliza set her book down and said, with the air of someone who has been sitting on information and has decided it is time to release it, "Mr. Beaumont wants Papa's water." Caroline looked up. "I beg your pardon. There is a spring on our land," Eliza said. "Papa says it is the best water in this part of the county. Mr. Beaumont wants to run cattle here, but the land he bought is dry. He needs the spring. He offered to buy it and Papa said no. And now he is trying to find other ways." She paused. "I heard Papa and Mr. Hollins talking about it. Mr. Hollins is Papa's lawyer friend from Abilene. He comes sometimes." "Eliza," Caroline said carefully, "does your father know you heard this?" "No," Eliza said with perfect serenity. "Perhaps you should tell him that you know," Caroline said. "Adults sometimes carry worries alone that do not need to be carried alone." Eliza considered this with her characteristic gravity. "Do you carry worries alone, Miss Whitfield?" Caroline stopped. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "I am learning to do it less." Eliza nodded as though this confirmed something she had already concluded. She picked her book back up and Caroline returned to the slates, and the afternoon light moved golden and slow through the schoolhouse windows. When Walter came for Eliza, he looked tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with accumulated pressure. Caroline had made the decision before she was entirely conscious of making it. "Mr. Merritt," she said, before he could collect Eliza and leave, "would you sit for a moment?" He looked surprised, but he sat in the chair across from her desk that was usually occupied by students she needed to speak with separately. It occurred to her that the chair was somewhat too small for him, and that he sat in it anyway without comment, which she found characteristic. She told him carefully what Eliza had shared. She watched his face move through several things rapidly before it settled back into its customary steadiness. "I see," he said. "Eliza did not mean any harm by telling me. She was concerned about you." "She is 8, he said, with a complex expression that was exasperation and love and helplessness in approximately equal parts. "She is very attentive for 8, Caroline said, "and very loyal." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Beaumont's approach to you, the school visits." "I assumed they were simply what they appeared to be," Caroline said. "Am I wrong?" He looked at her directly. "I think he may believe that if he has a claim on you, it gives him leverage on me." The word leverage fell between them with a particular weight. "That is a repugnant assumption," Caroline said, "both about what I might constitute as leverage and about me as an independent person." "Yes," he said, "it is." His jaw tightened. "It is not a threat to you from him." He is the kind of man who works through legal mechanisms and social pressure rather than anything direct, but he is persistent. So am I, Caroline said. He looked at her and the almost smile came, and this time it was a little more than almost. I am aware, he said. They sat for a moment in the golden afternoon quiet, and it was the first time they had been this close to something real and had not immediately looked away from it. How long has he been pressuring you about the spring? She asked. Since February. He came first with an offer I refused, then with a higher offer. Then with a lawyer's letter arguing some obscure historical water rights claim that my lawyer says has no merit but will be expensive to defend. And in the meantime he arrived in town and began this. She gestured vaguely. Yes, he is a strategist. Walter said it without admiration. He looks for pressure points. Then we simply ensure he does not find them, Caroline said. The we was not planned. It arrived naturally and sat in the air between them with the quiet, solid presence of something true. Walter looked at it. She could see him looking at it. Miss Whitfield, he said, and his voice was low and careful, I want to say something honestly. Please do, she said. I am aware that I am a man with a complicated situation. I have a ranch that is currently the subject of legal pressure. I have a daughter who is not always conventionally understood. I have a history I do not often discuss. I am not the kind of man who has easy things to offer. Mr. Merritt, Caroline said, I am a widow who came to Texas on her sister's couch with a trunk of books and a bank account that totaled $42. I am also not the kind of person who has easy things to offer. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in the guarded architecture of his expression shifted, and for the first time she saw behind it, not grief, though that was there, but a kind of loneliness so long-standing it had become structural, and behind that a warmth that was enormous and very carefully contained, like a fire that has learned to keep itself from burning the wrong things. I think, he said very slowly, that we have been circling something. We have, she agreed. I am not certain how to stop circling. I think, she said, you could start by asking me to have supper with you, somewhere with other people present since we are in a small town and discretion is important, and somewhere Eliza can come since I suspect she would appear regardless. The smile broke through properly then, fully, and it transformed his face in a way that made her catch her breath, because it turned out that underneath all that guarded quiet he was a man capable of warmth that could heat a room. Would Sunday evening suit you? He said. Sunday evening would suit me very well, she said. He stood, collected Eliza, said good night with an expression that was barely controlled, and she heard Eliza say as they went out the door, Papa, you are smiling, with the odd reverence of someone reporting a natural phenomenon. She pressed both hands against her face and laughed into them, alone in the schoolhouse for a solid and completely unprofessional 2 minutes. Sunday supper was at Aliner's house, which was Caroline's suggestion for exactly the reason she had stated, discretion and the small-town requirement of propriety, but also because Aliner set an extraordinary table and could be relied upon to create an atmosphere warm enough to ease any awkwardness. Aliner was also extremely pleased about this turn of events, which she expressed by cooking enough food for 12 people, and then inviting only Walter and Eliza, and making sure everyone had been fed within the first 20 minutes so that the meal could slide comfortably into conversation. Walter brought a bottle of decent wine, which was not a thing you could easily find in Redemption Creek, and which Aliner noted with raised eyebrows that she directed at Caroline behind Walter's back. He brought Eliza in her blue ribbon dress, and was himself in a clean dark shirt that fit him properly, and he sat across the table from Caroline and they talked, really talked, for the first time without the necessary abbreviated quality of doorway conversation. They talked about books. They discovered they had both read the same Dickens novels in the same year, and disagreed about which character was the most deserving of better circumstances, which became an argument that was entirely warm and animated, and that Aliner's husband Frank, who had not read the Dickens novels but had opinions about most things, joined with some irrelevance but genuine enthusiasm. Eliza ate her supper with scientific precision, clearing her plate in steady intervals while cataloging every element of the conversation with her serious eyes. And when she was done, she asked Frank Dodd if she might see the new foal that he had mentioned earlier, which was a request Frank was delighted to fulfill, and Alina found a reason to accompany them, and Caroline and Walter were left alone at the table in the lamplight. The shift in the room was immediate and gentle. "Your sister is not very subtle," Walter said. "She has never tried to be," Caroline agreed. "It is one of her best qualities." He was quiet for a moment, turning his wine glass in his hands. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "How long did it take before it stopped hurting all the time?" She understood immediately that he was asking about loss, about the particular grief of losing a spouse. "About a year," she said. "And then it changed. It did not stop exactly. It just became something I carried differently, like the difference between holding something at arm's length and carrying it close where it does not require so much energy to hold." He nodded slowly. "Clara has been gone 3 years, and I still sometimes expect to hear her in the kitchen in the morning." He paused. "Eliza is so like her in some ways. She has her mother's mind. The way of gathering information and organizing it. She is also very like you," Caroline said. "She has your steadiness, your honesty. She does not perform things she does not feel." He looked at her. "You have been paying attention." "So have you," she said quietly. The lamp between them was small and warm, and the Texas night outside the window was enormous and full of stars, and they sat in the space between those two realities and let themselves be aware of each other without the careful management of feeling that had been necessary until now. "I have been thinking," he said, "since Thursday, about what you said, we." "I noticed that I said it," she said. "Did you mean it?" She met his gaze. His eyes in the lamplight were not gray but very dark, and they held her without pressure, with a kind of patient, open waiting that she had not experienced before, the look of a man who will accept whatever answer he is given and will not push. "Yes," she said, "I meant it." He exhaled slowly. "Then I would like very much to court you properly, if that is something you want." "It is something I want," she said. He nodded. He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers briefly, just for a moment, the warm weight of it. Then he withdrew it and straightened and picked up his wine glass and said, "Good," in a tone of such studied calm that she could see exactly how much it cost him to be that calm, which told her more than anything else he could have said. Eliza came back inside 20 minutes later with hay in her hair and stars in her eyes from the foal, and she looked at her father and then at Caroline and then at her father again, and said nothing at all, which was the loudest statement she had ever made. The courtship of Caroline Whitfield and Walter Merritt was, by the standards of Redemption Creek, both entirely proper and quietly revolutionary. He called on Sunday afternoons, leaving Eliza with Alina's family so that he and Caroline could walk in the less traveled paths north of town, where the spring wildflowers were coming in thick, and the afternoon light lay in long golden bars across the grass. They talked, they argued, they laughed, which surprised both of them the first time it happened, a genuine, easy laughter that arrived without warning over something absurd she said about the school board's opinion of mathematics. She had not laughed like that in a very long time. She had not known how much she missed it. He was courtly in the old-fashioned, sincere way, not performative but principled, bringing wildflowers rather than hothouse roses because wildflowers were what was here, and he said with perfect seriousness that he did not believe in giving people things imported from somewhere else when what was right here was beautiful enough. She kept the flowers in a jar on her window, and they lasted longer than she expected. He told her slowly, over several Sundays, about Virginia, about his family, who had money and expectations and a very particular idea of what Walter Merritt's life should look like, about a woman he had been engaged to before Clara, a woman his family had chosen, and the engagement he had broken at considerable personal and social cost, because he did not love her and could not pretend otherwise. About Eliza's mother, who had not been a woman his family approved of, and Eliza's birth before the marriage, and the marriage that had followed because Walter had been determined that whatever errors of judgment he had made, Eliza would have a father who stood beside her. "Clara died before she had to choose whether to stay or go," he said once, looking out over the plain. "I do not know if she would have stayed. I like to think she would, but I do not know." "It takes courage to not know something and to admit it," Caroline said. He looked at her. "You do not judge easily." "I judge," she said, "but I try to judge actions, not people's complicated insides." "What do you judge me for?" he said. It was a sincere question, not a defensive one. She thought about it honestly. "Nothing yet," she said. "I am watching." He laughed, and it was the real laugh, the open one, and she felt it like light. The Beaumont problem came to a head in the first week of June, and it did so in the public arena of the town rather than the private one of legal letters. Beaumont had been working on a campaign, subtle but effective, to suggest that the spring on Walter's land was in fact fed by a source that historically had been considered community property before the land grants had been filed. It was legally dubious but socially potent in a community that depended on water, and he had been planting the suggestion in conversations at the saloon and at the feed store with the patience of a man who understood that public opinion was its own kind of leverage. The town meeting on the subject was held in the church on a Tuesday evening in June. Caroline sat beside Alina and Frank. Walter sat with his lawyer friend Hollins, who had come down from Abilene specifically for this purpose, a spare, sharp-faced man with the kind of eyes that read documents the way some people read faces. Beaumont presented his position with smooth, reasonable authority. He had documents. He had maps. He had witnesses who had heard various things that, taken together, sounded almost like a case. Walter sat and listened with his arms crossed and his expression entirely contained. When Beaumont finished, Hollins stood and dismantled the argument with the methodical pleasure of a man who has spent 3 weeks preparing for precisely this moment. He had deeds. He had the original grant survey, properly dated and filed. He had correspondence from the land office in Austin that was unambiguous on the question of water rights attached to the land parcel. He had, in short, everything he needed, and he laid it out with the quiet devastation of someone who does not need to raise his voice to win. The room turned. Beaumont kept his pleasant face throughout, but Caroline watched his hands on the pew in front of him, and she could see the tight stillness of them, the leashed and angry energy of a man who has lost and is already recalculating. Sheriff Briggs, who had been listening with his single good eye fixed on Beaumont throughout the proceedings, said at the end that the matter appeared to be settled to his satisfaction, and that he hoped they could all agree it was time to move forward. Most people agreed. Beaumont smiled with his mouth and said he respected the process and had simply wanted to ensure the community's interests were protected, which was admirable in its shamelessness. Afterward, in the yard outside the church in the warm June night, Walter found Caroline in the crowd. He did not say anything immediately. He simply stood beside her, and the quiet of him beside her was solid and warm and entirely different from the careful, orbiting distance of the past weeks. "It is over?" she asked. "For now," he said. "Beaumont is not the kind of man who decides he was wrong, but his legal position is finished, and without a legal position he has no lever. He will move on to somewhere more tractable." "Will he?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "I will make sure of it." She believed him. Not because of any threat in his voice, but because of the quiet, certain knowledge that this was a man who, once he had decided something needed doing, simply did it. Beaumont left Redemption Creek at the end of June. He sold his land contract to a cattle company out of Fort Worth and departed without ceremony. Caroline watched the wagon leave from the schoolhouse window and felt, with some embarrassment, a wave of relief so large it was almost physical. She was already in love with Walter Merritt by then. She had been in love with him for some time and had been watching herself be in love with him with a combination of tenderness and exasperation, the way you watch a force of nature that you cannot stop and have decided you do not want to stop. He had not yet told her he loved her, but she knew. She knew it in the way he listened to her, with the full attention of a man who is not waiting for his turn to speak, but is genuinely receiving what she says. She knew it in the way he positioned himself between her and anything uncertain without making it obvious. She knew it in the way he spoke to Eliza about her, the fragments she caught second-hand from Eliza's reports, the way he had said her shawl was the color of something kept safe indoors. She knew it in his eyes. On a Sunday afternoon in the middle of July, they walked north of town in the late afternoon heat, which was considerable because Texas in July is not interested in your comfort, and they found a stand of cottonwood trees near the creek that gave a tolerable shade, and they sat in it and talked and were quiet in turns in the easy way that had become their usual rhythm. He was silent for a while, looking at the creek, and she let him be silent because she had learned that his silences were not empty. "I have been thinking," he said finally, "about what I want to say to you. I have been thinking about it for quite some time." She looked at the creek also, because sometimes it is easier to be honest when you are both looking at the same thing. "I want to say it correctly," he said. "It matters to me that it is correct." "It will be," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, "I have spent 3 years being alone in a way that I told myself was sustainable because it had to be. And then you came into the general store with your shawl and your composure and your completely devastating honesty about your $42 and your trunk of books, and I have not been alone in the same way since, even when you were not there." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her now with the full, open look that he did not give cheaply. "I love you, Caroline," he said. "I want you to know it plainly and without condition. And I want, if you are willing, to ask you to consider a future with me and Eliza, not because Eliza needs a mother, though I think she would love you as one, but because I am selfish enough to want you for myself." She had thought she would feel surprise. She did not. She felt the landing of something that had been building for months, the completion of a movement that had been suspended in its final note. "Walter," she said, "I have been in love with you since you called the color of my shawl something kept safe indoors." He stared at her. "Eliza told you that." "She did. I did not intend for that to be transmitted." "I am very glad it was." She reached out and took his hand, and his fingers closed around hers with a care that felt like a pledge. "Yes," she said clearly, because he deserved clarity. "I will consider a future with you. I will, in fact, say yes to it now if you are asking." "I am asking," he said. "Then yes." He looked at her for a long, breathing moment, and then he leaned forward and kissed her, and it was quiet and warm and honest, exactly like everything else about him, and the cottonwood leaves turned silver in the light above them, and the creek moved past without comment. Eliza, when told, received the information with 3 seconds of silence followed by a nod of profound satisfaction that communicated that she had seen this coming since the second week of April and was pleased to report that her assessment had been correct. "Does this mean you will live on the ranch?" she asked Caroline. "Eventually," Caroline said, "if that is all right with you." Eliza looked at her with those grave brown eyes. "Miss Whitfield," she said, "I have been asking Papa when he was going to stop being lonely since I was 6 years old. It is more than all right with me." Caroline pulled the child into a hug and felt Eliza's thin arms come around her neck and hold tight, and she pressed her face against Eliza's braids and thought, with a gratitude that went all the way down, that she had arrived in Redemption Creek with a trunk and $42 and had somehow found everything. They did not rush. They were both careful people with an understanding of what permanence required. Walter came every Sunday. They continued to walk and talk. He brought her to the ranch in August, and she saw the water system he was so proud of, and she was, in fact, genuinely impressed because it was elegant and practical, and it solved the problem of distributing water across a larger area than any simple trough could manage. And she told him so with the full weight of her honest opinion, and he was more pleased by this than he could entirely conceal. She walked through the house, which was solidly built and full of light, and had been furnished by a man doing his best without the architecture of a shared life. Everything functional and nothing quite in the right place. She stood in the kitchen and looked out the window at the wide, flat land going gold in the August light. "It needs some thought," she said. "Not much. The bones are right." "I was hoping you would say that," he said from the doorway. She turned and looked at him in his own house, and it was the most right she had seen him look in any space. They were married in September of 1882, in the church with the listing steeple, on a Saturday morning when the Texas weather had finally decided to cooperate, and delivered a cool, brilliant blue sky of the kind that makes everything look possible. Caroline wore her blue dress with new white lace at the collar that Alina had added, and she carried wildflowers because Walter had brought them, and said he still did not believe in importing things from somewhere else when what was right here was beautiful enough. Eliza wore her white dress with the blue ribbon, and stood beside her father with the grave solemnity of someone participating in a sacrament, which in her understanding she was. The Reverend said the words. Walter held her hands and looked at her through the whole of it with the open, warm, full look that she still found astonishing in its completeness, and when it was the moment for him to say what he chose to say beyond the formal words, he said, quietly enough that only she heard, "I will be honest with you for the rest of my life, Caroline. That is the promise I mean most." She squeezed his hands and said, "And I will be honest with you. That is mine." They were married. They went home to the ranch in the afternoon, the three of them, Caroline and Walter and Eliza, and the house that had been functional settled almost immediately into something warmer and more alive with her things distributed through it, her books on the shelves, her shawl on the peg by the door. She continued to teach school. This was not in question. Walter understood that her work was not an alternative to her life but a component of it, and he had never, not for a single moment, suggested otherwise. Eliza continued to be the most advanced student in the school, which was sometimes inconvenient and always magnificent. The ranch was good. The water system continued to be the best water source for miles around, and with Beaumont gone there was no further conflict about it. Walter had two hired hands, brothers named Diego and Tomas Reyes, who had been with him for 2 years and received him, and by extension Caroline, with the warm, matter-of-fact acceptance of people who judge by what is in front of them rather than by what people tell them to see. Diego was 22 and Tomas 25, and they worked the cattle with a thoroughness that Walter trusted completely. The brothers had come up from south of the border 5 years earlier, and they carried with them the particular double wariness of men who had found a place that treated them fairly and were careful not to take it for granted, because experience had taught them not to. Caroline treated them with the same full and uncomplicated respect she gave everyone, and she watched some of the wariness ease over the months as they understood that this was consistent and not performance. She made Sunday dinners that included the Reyes brothers, because it seemed obvious to her that a family meal on the ranch ought to include the people who made the ranch run. And the first time she set the full table for everyone, Walter looked at her with an expression that made her pretend to be very busy with the bread. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard on the Texas plains. It came early and stayed, and there were weeks when the wind off the plains cut through every layer of clothing and made the world feel very small and the distance between the ranch and town feel very large. Caroline had ridden before in Kansas City, but the Texas horses and the Texas distances were a different proposition, and Walter taught her the geography of the ranch on horseback on the cold Saturday mornings when school was not in session, the land that had seemed abstract on a map becoming real under her. She loved it. She had not expected to love the land quite this much. The enormous, patient indifference of it, the way it required your attention and your humility both, the way it was never finished with you. She came back from one of those January morning rides with color in her cheeks and genuine exhilaration that she had not managed to calm down by the time they reached the barn, and she was telling Walter something about the particular quality of light on frost at that time of day, and she turned to see what he thought and found him watching her with an expression so nakedly fond that she stopped talking entirely. "What?" she said. "You are the most alive person I have ever known," he said. "When you are interested in something, you are completely inside it. That sounds like a criticism. It is the opposite," he said. "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever watched." She looked at him in the cold barn light and thought that she could spend 40 years being looked at like that and it would never become ordinary. She kissed him in the barn with the horses watching, which Eliza would have found enormously interesting if she had been there, but she was inside reading, which was a mercy. In the spring of 1883, Caroline understood she was expecting. She had suspected for several weeks, and had confirmed it with as much certainty as she could before she told Walter, because she did not want to raise and then dash a hope. She told him in the evening after Eliza was in bed in the kitchen, where he was mending a bridle strap and she was sitting across from him with a school book she had not actually been reading for the past half hour. "Walter," she said. He looked up. "I am going to have a child," she said. The bridle strap fell from his hands. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she could not entirely catalog, too many things moving through it too quickly. And then he got up from his chair and came around the table, and she stood up and he pulled her into his arms and held her, not dramatically, just completely, the way he did most things. "Are you well?" he said into her hair. "Very well," she said. He held her for a long time. She could feel the steadiness of his breathing and the careful, enormous care in his hands. When they told Eliza the next morning, she received the news with 3 seconds of silence, a nod, and then a very Eliza-like series of questions about timing and logistics, and where exactly the baby would sleep, which led to an entirely productive conversation about rearranging the second bedroom that resulted in Eliza designing, on her slate, a furniture plan that was actually quite sensible. Caroline continued to teach school until June, when the school year ended anyway and the heat made everything slower. She spent the summer on the ranch and in town, and she was large and cheerful, and her sister Alina fussed over her with the practiced authority of a woman who had been through this twice and considered herself an expert, which she was. In August of 1883, Caroline gave birth to a son. He was, as all newborns are, alarming and extraordinary and impossibly small and possessed of an opinion about everything that he communicated at considerable volume. Walter held him with the controlled terror of a man confronting something precious and fragile, and his face did the thing it did when he felt more than he could immediately contain. They named him James Thomas Merritt. James for Walter's grandfather, who had been, Walter said, the best man he had personally known. Thomas for Caroline's late husband, because she felt Thomas Whitfield deserved to be remembered well, and because naming her son after a man she had loved who was gone was not a betrayal of what she had now but a way of carrying all of it together. Walter had said when she suggested Thomas, "Are you certain?" "I am certain," she had said. "I love Thomas. He is gone. You are here. These are not in competition." He had looked at her for a moment and then nodded and said, "James Thomas," and it had settled into being right. Eliza was 9 years old and took her role as older sister with the same systematic seriousness she applied to everything. She developed opinions about proper technique for holding infants, which she researched through a medical book she borrowed from the doctor, and she communicated these to the adults around her with the careful authority of someone who has checked her sources. James grew in the way of healthy, well-loved children, loudly and insistently, and with great purpose. He was dark-eyed like his father and had Caroline's quick responsiveness to everything around him, and he showed signs from very early of being a child who would have opinions about the world and was not going to keep them to himself. Caroline returned to teaching that autumn with James at the ranch under the watch of Diego and Tomas's mother, Senora Reyes, who had moved to a small house on the ranch property the previous spring, and who received James with the magnificent practicality of a woman who has raised 6 children and finds infants entirely manageable. The arrangement worked. Caroline was happier for the work, and James was safe and loved, and Eliza managed the situation with the proprietary authority of a child who has established herself as the primary authority on infant care in the household and checks in at lunch to verify that her standards are being met. The years moved in the way that good years do, with enough texture to be interesting and enough peace to be nourishing. Redemption Creek grew. New families came in on the cattle trails and stayed. The school expanded, first to 2 rooms and then to 3, and Caroline was joined eventually by a second teacher, a quiet young woman named Helena Park, who had come from Virginia and turned out to be excellent at mathematics and endearingly bewildered by everything else about the frontier. Walter's ranch became one of the more successful operations in the county. The water from the spring continued to be the defining advantage, and he used it wisely, not hoarding it but making sensible agreements with neighboring ranches that created goodwill and a network of mutual support that served everyone better than the competitive isolation that Beaumont had tried to exploit. Diego and Tomas Reyes were, by 1885, no longer hands in the subordinate sense but genuine partners in the operation, their knowledge of cattle and range fully equal to and in some respects surpassing Walter's, and he restructured their arrangement accordingly, with equity stakes and formal partnership documents that his friend Hollins drew up with precise care. It was not the way most ranches in Texas operated in 1885, and Walter was aware of this and considered it other people's problem. Eliza turned 13 in the summer of 1885 and had by then consumed every book in Caroline's library, the school library, and a considerable portion of the county doctor's personal collection. She was writing essays that would not have been out of place in a college journal, which was both wonderful and complicated, because college for a girl in Texas in 1885 was not an obvious path. Caroline began a quiet and determined correspondence with institutions in the Northeast on Eliza's behalf. She did not mention this to Eliza until she had something concrete to present, because she was her father's daughter in the matter of not raising hopes she could not yet verify. Walter knew what she was doing. He knew because he watched her at the kitchen table on winter evenings with the correspondence spread before her, and he understood what it was. "You are writing to schools for her," he said one evening. "I am," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "She will go," he said. "If there is a place for her, she will go, even though I will not know what to do with myself for the first year." "You will write her extremely long letters," Caroline said. "I will," he agreed. "And you will write better ones." "Mine will be better," she confirmed. "But yours will mean more." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, and his expression was everything she had come to know, the warmth and the steadiness and the openness he gave only here, only to her and Eliza and now James, and she felt the completeness of it in the way that good things become more themselves over time rather than less. In the autumn of 1885, Caroline discovered she was expecting again. She told Walter in the kitchen again in the same way, and he did the same thing, set down what was in his hands and came to her, and held her exactly as he had the first time, with the same complete and careful attention. "Another one," he said into her hair. "Another one," she agreed. This time it was Eliza who organized the household adjustments, at 13, with the systematic authority of someone who has been running logistics in her head for 5 years and welcomes the official assignment. She produced a written plan for the nursery rearrangement, the Senora Ray's schedule, and James's adjustment to the situation that was frankly better organized than most things Caroline had seen from adults, and she presented it at supper with the calm of someone expecting it to be implemented, which it was. James, at 2, understood approximately that something was happening and expressed his feelings about it by going through a period of demanding to be carried everywhere, which Eliza accommodated with the resigned, loving tolerance of a sister who has already decided she is in charge. In April of 1886, Caroline had a daughter. She was a fierce, red-faced, determined infant who arrived 2 weeks early and at considerable speed, as though she had decided she had waited long enough. They named her Clara Margaret Merritt. Clara for Walter's first wife, Eliza's mother, because Walter had sat beside Caroline in the weeks before the birth and said quietly that if it was a girl he would like to honor Clara, and Caroline had said immediately and without any shadow of reservation that she thought that was exactly right. Margaret was for Caroline's own mother, who had died the previous year, and whom Caroline had gone to Kansas City to see one last time, spending 2 weeks away from the ranch in the cold of the previous January, and who had said, looking at Caroline's life with the critical and loving eye of a woman who had always wanted the best for her daughter, that she was satisfied. Clara Margaret arrived, and Eliza received her with the same nod and assessment she gave everything. And James, 3 years old by this time, took one look at his new sister and decided she was acceptable and returned to his primary occupation of discovering every possible way to climb things that were not designed to be climbed. Life on the Merritt Ranch in the years that followed was full in the way that good lives are full, not without difficulty, but with the kind of difficulty that can be met, the hard winters and the dry summers, and the cattle prices that rose and fell with the particular indifference of markets, and the school board that had opinions about curriculum that Caroline sometimes agreed with and sometimes did not, and the ordinary machinery of raising children who were intelligent and individual and had their own ideas about everything. Walter and Caroline had the arguments of two people who are honest with each other and occasionally disagree, and they resolved them in the way of people who have agreed that the resolution matters more than the victory, and they came back to each other after arguments with the particular tenderness of people who are not afraid of the argument's existence. There was one harder season, in the winter of 1887, when a disease moved through the cattle herd and they lost a third of it over 6 terrible weeks. Walter was silent for days at a time in the way he became when the weight was large, the compressed stillness of a man managing something by sheer will, and Caroline gave him the space to do it while making sure the space was warm, present, and supplied with food and coffee, and her own steady, quiet company, so that being silent was not the same as being alone. The herd was rebuilt over the following 2 years. Diego Reyes turned out to have a particular gift for identifying the bloodlines that would recover best in the local conditions, and the rebuilt herd was in some respects stronger than what had been lost, which was the kind of thing that becomes a story you tell later when it is over, and the loss has turned into the thing that made you stronger. Eliza left for the East in September of 1888, at 15, for a preparatory school in Boston that Caroline had found through her correspondence network, and that had agreed to admit Eliza on the basis of her written examinations, which had impressed the admission committee to the point of enthusiasm. She was not the first girl from Texas to go to school in Boston, but she was among the very few, and she went with the seriousness and self-possession of someone who has been preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity her whole life. The morning she left was difficult in the way that large love makes departures difficult. Walter stood on the platform at the railroad station that had come to Redemption Creek the previous year and held his daughter for a long time, and she held him back with the same contained, complete force that was entirely her father's and entirely her own simultaneously. She shook hands with James, who was 5, with great gravity, and told him she expected him to take care of the foals in her absence, which he agreed to with the seriousness the request deserved. She kissed Clara, who was 2 and did not fully understand what was happening but was cooperative about the kiss. She hugged Caroline last, and she held on, and she said against Caroline's shoulder in a voice that was very nearly steady, "Thank you for what you did for me." Caroline held her tight. "You did it yourself," she said. "We just helped you get where you were going." The train took her east, and Walter stood and watched until it was entirely gone, and Caroline stood beside him with her arm through his and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and sometimes love is only the willingness to be present. He was quiet for a day. Then he was himself again, the way he always came back to himself, through the work and the land and the particular grounding force of a life that was real and present and continuing. Eliza wrote letters. She wrote them to all of them, separately, which was very much like her, different letters with different things inside them. The academic letters to Caroline full of what she was learning and arguing with. The warmer, less formal letters to Walter full of what she was seeing and noticing. The enthusiastic but somewhat chaotic letters to James full of descriptions of the city that James received with wide eyes, and a conviction that Boston must be the most interesting place in the world. She was brilliant and she flourished, and she was also, reliably, completely herself, still the serious girl with the grave brown eyes who told people her age without being asked, and gathered information by listening, and trusted that what was true was worth saying. In the spring of 1890, Caroline found herself expecting for the third time. She was 35, which she was aware was not young for another pregnancy, and she approached the doctor with the practical directness that characterized everything she did, and was told she was healthy, and that while he would recommend caution, she had no reason for particular concern. She told Walter in the kitchen, in the evening, as she always had. He set down what was in his hands. He came to her. He held her. "Third time," he said. "Third time," she said. He kissed the top of her head and then her cheek, and then, when she turned her face up, her mouth, with the slow, warm certainty of 8 years of knowing her. James, at 7, responded to the news by asking a series of engineering questions about how the baby was going to get out, which Walter deflected with the practiced authority of a man who has learned to have a different answer for every question James produces. Clara, at 4, said she wanted a sister because she already had a brother, which was delivered with such perfect logic that no one could argue with it. In November of 1890, Caroline had another son. He was easy and large and arrived without drama, as though he had assessed the situation from the available information and decided the most efficient approach was the most cooperative one. They named him Henry Walter Merritt. Henry because Caroline had always loved the name and because, she said, the family needed a Henry. Walter for Walter, because by their third child they had decided they were not done putting his name in the world. Clara, 4 years old and in possession of strong opinions, was initially disappointed and then decided within approximately 20 minutes that she was instead the elder sister of 2 brothers, and that this was a position of considerable authority, which it became. James accepted Henry with the expansive generosity of an older brother, who is old enough to understand that the addition does not diminish anything and young enough to find an infant genuinely fascinating. The ranch and the school and the town moved forward through the early 1890s with the accumulated momentum of things well built. Redemption Creek had become less raw by then, more settled, with the peculiar quality of a frontier town that has crossed the invisible line from temporary to permanent. The church repaired, new buildings in brick, the school now a proper institution with 3 rooms and 4 teachers, and a library that Caroline had built over 9 years of donations, letter writing, and the occasional gentle relentlessness that was her particular gift. Walter had gray at his temples by 1892, which Caroline found made him look distinguished in a way that she told him and he disputed. And she told him she was the authority on this and he disagreed, and she was right. She had lines at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting into the Texas light and from years of laughing, and Walter traced them sometimes with his thumb, with an expression that she had learned meant he was thinking something he found too large to put into words but could express this way in this gesture, and she understood it, which was its own language. Eliza came home in the summer of 1892, the summer she turned 20. She came home from Boston with 2 years of preparatory education and a scholarship to a women's college in Massachusetts, And she came home with the particular kind of energy of a person whose mind has been seriously engaged for the first time in a context large enough to contain it. She was brilliant and confident and still entirely herself, still the 8-year-old with the grave eyes who had told a stranger her age, and called her father very trustworthy and organized information with the methodical care of someone who believes the world can be understood if you pay attention. She stayed for the summer. She spent it riding the land with Walter, who showed her everything that had changed and everything that had stayed the same. And she spent it talking with Caroline late into the evenings after the children were in bed. The kind of talk that happens between two people who are both readers and thinkers and have been corresponding for years and now have the luxury of the words in the same room. She went back east in August, and Walter and Caroline stood on the platform together and watched the train go and then looked at each other. "She will change the world," Walter said. "Parts of it," Caroline agreed. "The parts she touches. That is more than most people manage," he said. She took his hand as they walked back from the station, and he held it with the same warm, certain grip of 8 years of everything. And Main Street of Redemption Creek went about its midday business around them, and the Texas sky above was enormous and completely indifferent and absolutely magnificent. The story of Walter and Caroline Merritt was not a secret in Redemption Creek. Everyone knew it, as people in small towns know the stories that matter, the outline and the shape of it, the shawl on the post and the man who brought it inside, and the daughter who told a stranger that her papa was very trustworthy. It had become, in the years since, one of those small, true stories that circulate in communities and take on the quality of the things people tell because they need to believe they are true, because they represent something that people want to believe is possible, that a grief can end, that a careful, guarded person can open, that a woman who arrived with $42 and a trunk of books can build something whole and permanent, that a man who carried his history as a burden can lay it down without losing himself. The shawl was still on the peg by the door of the ranch house. It had been there for 11 years by the time James was 10, and asking questions about everything, and Clara was 6, and ruling the household with her father's steadiness and her mother's precision, and Henry was 3, and had opinions about everything that he expressed with volume. Caroline stood at the kitchen window on a March morning in 1893, looking out at the land that had become hers in the particular way that the land you have worked and weathered becomes yours, not by document but by something prior to document, and she heard Walter's boots on the porch and the door, and then his hands were on her shoulders, warm from the morning outside. "What are you looking at?" he said. "The same thing I look at every morning," she said. And every morning it is different," she said. "The light is always different. Everything changes without warning." He turned her and she turned, and they were face to face in the kitchen, in the March morning light, 11 years into a life that neither of them had planned and both of them had built with everything they had. "I am still very trustworthy," he said. She laughed, which she had not known she was going to do, the real, complete laugh that he had given back to her along with everything else. "Eliza's assessment stands," she said, "confirmed over 11 years of evidence." He pulled her close and she went, resting against him in the morning quiet of their kitchen, the children still asleep, the ranch beginning its day outside, the creek somewhere beyond the window moving over its stones the way it always had and always would. "Are you happy?" he said. He asked her this sometimes, not as a test or an anxiety but as a genuine, recurring question, the question of a man who considers it important to know and never assumes the answer. "I am very happy," she said. "Are you?" "More than I knew how to be," he said, "before." She tilted her head back and looked up at him, at the strong, angular face and the gray eyes and the gray at his temples and the smile lines that were her favorite feature of his face because she had made some of them herself. And she thought that a life is built the way anything solid is built, piece by piece and choice by choice, and with the willingness to be present for all of it, the hard and the beautiful and the ordinary and the astonishing. "Good," she said. He kissed her forehead. he kissed her cheek. He said he was going out to check the water system because Diego had mentioned something was loose in the eastern connection, and she said she was going to wake the children and make breakfast, and they separated for the morning with the ease of people whose lives are woven at the root. She went to the door and unhooked the cream-colored shawl from its peg and wrapped it around her shoulders against the last of the winter chill, and then she called the children up from their rooms, James first, then Clara, then Henry, who required 2 calls and a third louder one, and the kitchen filled with children and noise and the smell of coffee and cornbread, and outside the window the Texas morning stretched itself open over the land, wide and bright and full of everything that might still happen. The shawl had come inside 11 years ago in the hands of a man who was very trustworthy, as reported by his daughter. It had never left again. Some things once brought in from the wind belong inside. Some warmth once found you do not let go. The creek moved on. The land held. The light changed and changed and changed, the way it does here, the way it always does, without warning and without apology, and all of it was exactly right.